One of the more common approaches to creating hair in ZBrush is using curves. Curves allow you to easily manipulate the shape and curvature of your strands, while also ensuring consistency in the style and level of detail. There are many curve-based brushes out there, but the one I've been using the most for my characters has been DE Hair Tubes, which was made by character artist Dylan Ekron. Let's go over the fundamentals of using this brush and set it up for hair creation. First, select the hairbrush and pick between 6 different options. I usually go with thick A just because it gives me the best level of detail and I can kinda play around with it a little bit more. Then go to the curve modifier option under the stroke menu and select the curve fall off that you have for the strand. Essentially, the left side of the fall off dictates the shape of the root, so I usually like to keep it pretty thick, and the right side is the tip, so naturally it would go a little bit smaller, kind of create a natural shape. You can hold and move the top of the dotted line to change the root location, the bottom to change the tip, and anywhere in between just to change the overall curvature. Once you're happy with it, you can just click outside the line on the mesh itself, and that will apply your shape. At this point, you can start using the regular brushes you're familiar with, like the move brush, to kind of shape it a little bit more to your liking. One more thing I like to do is to split up the strand into a different subtool, which makes it a little bit easier to work with. You can do that by turning it into a different polygroup and then hitting group split. Now that we got the basics out of the way, I'm gonna speed up the footage a little bit. I'll be providing some useful tips and tricks along the way, so make sure to follow along. So let's talk about some of the things we want to avoid while working with curves. So the first thing is don't subdivide. So we kind of talked about this earlier. Subdividing limits you in a lot of ways when it comes to doing certain actions, right? So for example, if we want to change the topology, or we want to use Z-modeler in general, or a lot of other features that are kind of blocked when you have subdivisions. So I normally just use dynamic subdivs. So that's the first thing. The second thing is don't sculpt. So this is one of the main differences between this and the previous method that we went over. Is with curves you have the sculpted information sort of baked into the actual brush, so you can see some of those nice hard lines that you have running down the center of the strands. So we want to retain that, and because we don't really have a lot of geometry or polygons to work with, then using your traditional sculpting brushes would not really help you get a nice clean result because it kind of messes things up, and you also don't really have enough geo for that. So don't use Damien Standard or Clay or anything like that. It's not going to serve your purpose. The next thing is using smooth. Be very careful when you do that because again, we want to retain some of that information that we have on the actual shape. So using smooth can just turn it into a very generic looking curve strap brush, for example, right? Because that's sort of what it looks like, and you lose a lot of that information. So if you're gonna decide to use smooth, take the Z intensity very low, I'd say between 1 and 5, just so you don't lose any of the information. One more thing is dynameshing. I don't do that at all when I'm working with curves. Because again, the good thing about curves is that it's very low poly, so it's very easy to manage. And by dynameshing, it kind of defeats the purpose because it goes back to the previous method of just using a pretty high poly mesh and basically sculpting things on top of that. So don't dynamesh, keep it low poly, use dynamic subdivs, and that should put you in a pretty good spot. So one of the things we want to pay attention to when we're working with strands is to just take it slow and be gentle, right? Again, retaining the shape is our focus at this point. So while you're kind of nudging them around and just playing around with some of the volumes, and you're using the move brush, I usually use a pretty low Z intensity. And if I'm using a tablet, then I would just use very low pressure, pen pressure, just because I want to make sure not to make any extreme, drastic changes. It's more about kind of shaping it to fit the flow that I want. The second thing, and I kind of talked about that earlier when we did our do's and don'ts, is variation. So you don't have to go ahead and use the brush every time to create a new strand. If you have a group of similar looking strands, then it's totally fine to duplicate one and just kind of create the second one from that first one. But just make sure they don't look duplicated. So you can see that the one I have selected right now was basically duplicated from the previous one, and now I'm duplicating the fourth one. But every time I do that, I kind of rotate the strand. I make it a little bit thinner or thicker, and just overlap it a little bit so you don't have a lot of parallel lines or tangents, which is one of the biggest things that you want to avoid. The next thing is using edge loops to your advantage, right? So there's pros and cons to using very low poly meshes. And by hitting Shift F, you can see the exact topology and the exact wireframe of the strand. And you'll notice that it's extremely low. So make sure you have not too many edge loops and not too few, but just the right amount. Now, I know that might sound a little bit confusing, but when you're creating a strand, if you have too many polygons, then it's very easy to make it wobbly or uneven or unclean. So the curves aren't as perfect as you're kind of wanting them to be because you have too many edge loops. So one thing I like to do is use Z-Modeler, and again, this is why it's good that we don't have any subdivisions. But by using the insert or delete options in edge selection on Z-Modeler, you can add or remove edge loops. And I do that all the time. Let's say I want to create a certain curve in a certain spot in the strand, but I don't have an edge loop. I won't try to force it or subdivide it, right? I want to keep everything low poly, but I need a little bit more control. So I would go to ZModeler, I would hit insert, and then I would add an edge loop exactly where I need it. And that gives me a little bit of extra control without making things harder for me. And the opposite is also true, right? Sometimes because it's so high poly, I would go and just manually delete certain edge loops just to make the dynamic subdiv work a little bit better, because that way you're creating a cleaner curve from one edge loop to another. To help you with that, one thing I really like to do is controlling the curve step. Basically, the higher the value, the more low poly it's going to be. So let's say I have a curve step of zero point 0.6 right now. And you'll notice that it's a little bit high poly. If I look at the actual wireframe, you'll notice that it's got a lot of edge loops right now. So one thing that you can always do is go to curve step and raise that amount to, let's say, from a zero point 0.6 to a 1, and then that gives you less edge loops. And then that just makes it a lot easier to control. And you can do the opposite, right? If you want your strand to be just a little bit more high poly, then you can just lower the curve step, and that gives you more edge loops. So it really depends on how long the strand is, how big it is, and how much control you want to have over it. So one question I get pretty often is whether I make my characters in T-pose or posed. So in the past, I used to work mostly symmetrically on a T-pose model, because it honestly, it makes things a little bit easier, because you only have to create one side, and as long as it's symmetrical, then you can just mirror it over to the other side, and that basically saves you a good amount of work. Um, Over the past few years, I've been kind of challenging myself with working asymmetrically, even though it obviously takes longer. But I find that the results are a lot more organic and natural, just because I think excessive symmetry can make things look pretty fake pretty quickly. And because nothing is perfectly symmetrical in life. Even if you're looking at a symmetrical design, there's always going to be some differences. So I think that working asymmetrically allows you to really kind of factor in a lot of things that you wouldn't normally be able to do. Like the way that her hair kind of falls on her right shoulder, or and the other half is kind of behind her back. If I sculpted this symmetrically, I would not have been able to get these kinds of results because she wouldn't have that pose, right? So once I started posing it, then I would have to change the hair, and then a lot of time it just feels very much like transpose master kind of pose, which isn't always bad, but I feel like if you know exactly what kind of look you're going for initially and you work in asymmetrically, then the results are often a lot more convincing. So I would definitely recommend that you challenge yourself by posing your model first, and then sculpting the hair on top of that. Sometimes even the clothes, right? Because the wrinkles can deform according to the pose itself. And as you can see here, I basically created the clothes in Marvelous Designer. I usually sculpt them. I do it all in ZBrush but I wanted really specific types of folds and wrinkles. So I use Marvelous Designer, which is a great tool. It's a lot of fun. It's very different from ZBrush just because you have to know a little bit about sewing and just the way that garments work in general. But I find that the results are can be pretty great if you know how to use it. So as you can see, I'm constantly switching materials between clay, matte, and a regular skin shade. And immediately, as soon as I do that, I notice a few things that just don't work. Right now, the strands are just looking very, very similar to each other. I really feel that it's been duplicated, and they're also very wobbly. So this is kind of what I'm trying to address right now. Just kind of nudging them a little bit, adding a little bit of variation, adding a nice level of overlap where you have the thinner strands or the flyaways, as I like to call them, kind of overlapping the bigger ones and kind of going under the crevices, just so it doesn't feel too stiff. Just so it feels like obviously the lighter strands will be affected by gravity differently than the bigger ones. They're just a little bit more light. So I like to kind of depict that with the way that they're kind of shaped, and it's a lot of trial and error, as I said. So I don't exactly know because I don't have a specific concept for this. Unlike most of my pieces, I just kind of wanted to experiment with this one. So again, just a lot of trial and error. Slowly, it's starting to feel a little bit more natural and dynamic. But I'm not rushing it, right? And I don't get panicked just because it doesn't look that great at this particular moment because I know it's just a matter of time and patience. Eventually, I'm pretty confident that I'll be able to get a nice result. So every once in a while, I like to do a quick little test render, as you can see. I try not to work in a vacuum. So before, I would spend a lot of time on a specific step, even multiple days or weeks, without really thinking about the next steps. So for example, I would just work on the sculpt without thinking about the textures, or I would work on the textures without thinking about the render. And you need everything to work harmoniously. So I like not to work in a vacuum. I like to, make a little bit of progress, then do a test render, then just apply some quick colors, just to kind of try to visualize the final result, and then that usually gives me much more consistent results. So one thing I want to talk about at this stage is prepping this for in-game implementation, or essentially, what do I need to do to make this game ready or ready for low poly? So the way this is built right now, even though it's low poly, it's far from optimized. If you isolate each strand and kind of look at the geometry of it, there's a lot of inconsistencies in the topology, and it's not something that you would consider optimized by any stretch of the imagination. So making it as a quick high poly, when you don't really care about the poly count and optimization, all of that, makes it a lot easier. But when you want to use this sort of workflow for a game that eventually is going to be implemented into a game engine, then you got to think about things a little bit differently. So the main thing I normally like to do when I'm creating this type of hairstyle for games is just trying to kind of condense the hair strands a little bit more, because it's not really animation friendly or rigging friendly to have a bunch of different strands that are kind of detached from each other. Because of poly count, you don't want it to be like a 30K triangle mesh, and also you don't want the riggers to have to make hundreds of different joints just to support the hairstyle that you make. So normally what I do, I split it up into hair groups, right? So I would have usually between 3 and 5 hair groups, where I would create the curves on top of them. And then when I'm done, I usually just merge them together. I either dynamesh them or I just keep them separate, but they're so close together that just doing a basic retopology and projecting that in a baking software like Marmoset or Substance gives me good results. It looks detached, but it's still part of the same mesh. But obviously, it has to go through a pretty extensive retopology process in order to be usable for games. So this character is pretty unique because normally I like to do fan art. I like to kind of have my own interpretation of or existing characters or characters that I grew up liking. With this one, I wanted to try a new original character. So I decided to call her Corporate Swordswoman. It's almost like an office worker or someone who works in IT or human resources or something like that, who has a rich history of swordsmanship. And then, something happens and she has to use her hidden katana. And I thought it was a pretty cool idea. It's pretty nice. There's definitely a lot more room for error when you're using an original character because you don't always know exactly how you want to portray it or what kind of things you want to do with it. But with this one, I had a bunch of references, and I kind of knew very early on that I wanted to try this particular approach. And yeah, even though it's still a work in progress, I am planning a few cool things for the render and just adding a little bit more details to the clothes or the katana or stuff like that. Really want to use this character to kind of go crazy and try some new techniques. And yeah, let's see how it ends up looking. So the second thing I get asked about the most, other than hair, is my cell shading workflow. It's pretty unique in that it looks cell shaded, which is not something you often see in ZBrush. ZBrush often has pretty hard sculpted aesthetic to its models, and I think with me, I kind of try to go the opposite route, where it looks as flat shaded as possible. I've done a stream with Pixelogic, in which I kind of go went over one of my latest characters, Ryu from Street Fighter, and they showed a few of my techniques, including for hair creation, but I also went into my cell shading workflow, and I think that's something that if you're into that kind of aesthetic, you would really enjoy. You can check that out on YouTube. It's a 2 hour stream. There's a lot of information, and quite a lot of it has to do with cell shading. So I think you'd be able to get a pretty good head start there. But in a nutshell, it's basically a custom setup that I'm using based primarily on the So Much NPR plugin, which is a really nice plugin that you can use that kind of creates pre-made setups for cell shading. Now you're not gonna get a perfect result right off the bat. You really have to sort of tweak it based on the character and based on certain areas that you want to accentuate. So with this character, for example, I wanted a nice hard rim light when she gets rendered. And also I didn't want any extreme shading on the face because I don't like when the shadows go under the cheeks or create a look that's a little bit too harsh. Generally speaking, I like to keep it as flat as possible. So if you want to check that out, feel free to head over to the Pixelogic YouTube page or Maxon as they're called now, and you can check out the live stream I had with Ian Robinson. So there's a lot of really handy techniques over there. I don't go as much into detail as now, but I think it's a nice overview of a lot of different kind of methods and tricks that I use when I'm creating my characters. So you'll notice that I'm using Transpose Master. It's one of the best tricks in ZBrush in my opinion. I use it a lot of time for posing because it allows you to control several subtools at once instead of separately. And I also use it very frequently for hair because as I mentioned, I tend to kind of keep it on separate subtools. So using Transpose Master allows me to shift all of them at once. Here's another example of me using polypaint to kind of drive some of the colors a little bit more. So I'm adding some highlights just to make the hair look a little bit more specular. Obviously, I can do that through the material settings, but because I like to keep a pretty soft and flat 2D look to my characters, then I try not to rely too heavily on material settings, and a lot of it comes from actual hand painting textures. So don't be afraid to always, even though you're working with dynamic subdivs and you really don't have a lot of polygons, then obviously polypaint is dependent on that because you're basically painting on top of the polygons as opposed to regular textures where the thing that drives the quality is the texture resolution. With polypaint, it's different because the more polygons you have, the more high detailed your colors can be. So because we work in very low poly, you're not going to be able to create any crazy intricate shapes as long as you're not subdividing and dynameshing. So that's the caveat. But the good thing is that you don't really need it because for me, I like to just add subtle color shifts. So highlights and shadows, and kind of think about where it would make sense for the hairs to be a little bit darker if they're under a different set of hair, or where they would catch a little bit of light, like the highlights that I just added. So I definitely recommend trying to kind of put those in relatively early because A, it's going to give you a better sense of what else is missing in terms of the kind of luster that you want to add to your hair. And B, I think that a lot of time it can make a big difference. And I know one of the biggest struggle for a lot of 3D artists in general, but 3D artists I think in particular, just because creating a character can take a long time. So I think one of the challenges is staying motivated. That's why for me, I very often try to make the model look as cool as early as possible, even if it doesn't look great. I'm trying to add little touches to make me believe in the potential of this model, because I know that the only thing holding me back from creating a really spectacular model is me and my own motivation and my own desire to see it through. So sometimes you need that visual satisfaction to help keep you going. So that's why I kind of add those little touches, just to make me think, okay, wow, this can actually look pretty good when I'm done with it. It just helps me visualize. So yeah, just experiment with it. One more tip I have for you is using folders. It's a relatively new feature. I think it was added a couple of years ago, and it's a really nice way of organizing your different subtools. So you'll notice that I have a separate folder for each hairstyle. So I have one for the long, the short, and the curve alpha one, which is the next one. And it's really useful to kind of turn them on and off because sometimes you have, let's say you're working on a character and they have several different garments and some of them overlap. So you want to be able to look at the undershirt and not manually have to turn off each and every subtool. So using folders allows you to do that very easily. You can also do that by an even newer feature, which is sort of like visibility sets. It's at the top of the subtool list. It's basically the V1, V2, V3 that you see. It basically designates which subtools get turned on or turned off when you click each of the V options. So let's say you want several different folders and different subtools to be turned on at once. Instead of having to do that manually, even for the actual folders, you can just kind of assign them to the visibility sets. So it's very useful because sometimes you need a good point of reference. Sometimes, I'm creating a certain hairstyle and then I switch over to a different hairstyle that I did and I start noticing some of the things that I lost. So it's a very useful tool, so just make sure to make the most of it. So you'll notice that whenever I make a new strand, I usually isolate the blockout mesh that's underneath. And I do that because it makes it easier for me to really designate the direction and kind of control the flow. Because sometimes it's not really accessible when you have everything visible. So just make sure to use that to your advantage. Just isolating the current block on mesh that you're working on and just getting into the little nooks and crannies just to get the right structure for your hair strands. So one question I get pretty often is what are my inspirations and influences? Because obviously every artist has had them, and people's art styles are dictated by their past experiences, their passions, what they enjoy looking at the most, and just the type of art that they're most into. You know, most people wouldn't willingly create art that they don't find appealing, and that is very much the case with me. My style has always been influenced by stylized aesthetics. So I think my biggest inspiration has been, in video games at least, has been Street Fighter and Final Fantasy. I've always very much been into Japanese video games, and my two favorite genres are RPGs and fighting games, which is why Final Fantasy is my favorite game series of all time, and I am actively working on a fighting game, which is multiverses, because that's always been my passion. Now, in terms of my actual style or the things that influenced it, so one of my favorite artists is Tetsuya Nomura, who has been the character designer for a lot of Final Fantasy games, including Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy 8, 10, and also Kingdom Hearts. And since those games were such a huge part of my childhood, that's the exact kind of characters that I would always sketch in my notebook at school, right? That just naturally evolved into what I'm doing now. So if you look at some of my old sketches from like, I don't know, 20 years ago, the characters look very much the same. They're obviously not as pretty just because I wasn't that good. It's obviously not 3D because I couldn't get into 3D by myself. I tried for many years back when I was in high school. It's very intimidating. I couldn't really get it by myself, but I knew what kind of characters I enjoy on a personal level. So I always stuck to that. I've tried realistic or I've tried super cartoony, which I still do from time to time, especially for multiverses because we have such a big, a diverse blend of different styles and characters. So you have a character like LeBron James or Arya Stark, and then you have a character like Bugs Bunny or Tom and Jerry or Jake the dog. And those really made me kind of step out of my comfort zone because they're hyper cartoony and really teaches you a thing or two about simplification and how to get the biggest bang for your buck with the least amount of complications or detail. And that's a challenge in and of itself. And that's actually been another influence for me because I found that I really enjoy creating super simple characters, right? Vivi, for example, who is one of the characters from Final Fantasy IX, which is my favorite game of all time. So he's a pretty almost cartoony character. He doesn't really have a face. His body is super exaggerated. His proportions are pretty different from most of my characters, but I had so much fun with that one. And again, the influences really go back to my childhood, and I think a lot, if not most artists, would say the same. That instinctively they knew pretty early on in their life what kind of, you know, art style they're into, right? So I think a lot of people who do realism, for example, would say that a large majority of their lives they spent admiring hyper-realistic art or just examining, facial features or micro details or that kind of stuff. And they kind of apply some of their learnings into their adult life and into their profession. And it's very much the same for me. I'm just applying a lot of the things that I saw as a child and as a young adult and that I liked. So certain eye shapes, face shapes, just body anatomy, the musculature of characters is something that I've always loved. Learning anatomy is definitely, it's a journey, and I think a lot of beginners can attest to how difficult that can be. But I've always practiced. Whenever I had some downtime, I would just work on my character's anatomy. Learn how, biceps work or proportions of head versus torso. At a certain point, you just remember, it almost becomes instinctual. You just, place it in a way that makes sense to you. And I know it can sound almost unprofessional when you can't really explain why something looks good. But you just know it because you've had enough experience to give you that sense of what's right and what's wrong. It's almost like a language where sometimes people would ask you, why do you pronounce a certain word a certain way in different contexts? You don't really have an explanation for it. It's just, it's always like just because, right? And I think that for artists, that's why it's not never something that can be 100% taught. It's something that you have to practice and something that you have to just learn by doing. So that's sort of my approach to art. Always see where you can improve. Being true to what you really enjoy. Don't go with the trend, right? I knew very early on that character art, for example, is a very competitive field. And a lot of people tried to discourage me from doing that. A lot of them, kept saying maybe go into a different field that's a little less competitive. And I knew that that wasn't even an option because I knew that it's either I do characters or I don't do 3D at all. And it's not that I don't enjoy doing environments or animation. I've done a lot of animation and I absolutely love it. But I knew what my expertise was, and I knew that I would never feel 100% happy with my profession unless I did exactly what I wanted to or what I'm most passionate about. And I also wouldn't be as good as other people, right? I could be an environment artist, but chances are I wouldn't have the same sensibilities as a character artist because I didn't grow up researching it as I did. So I guess that's my biggest tip to you. Don't just kind of follow the trends or go along with what you think would give you the highest chance for success. Do what you actually enjoy and invest in it 100%, even outside of work hours. You need to want to do it as opposed to feel like you have to. Just be passionate about it, and your skill and your talent will shine through. And I know that kind of sounds a little bit cliche, but that's exactly how it works. I mean, every artist that you've ever looked up to, they do it, a certain way because they want to, not because they're being told to. They enjoy art. They're passionate about art, which is what allows them to be so good. So just be passionate about it. Just be true to yourself and you'll make it. It can take time, but you'll make it. So if you're new to ZBrush, you might be wondering why my UI looks so different. And the reason is because it's a custom UI. If you don't have one, then I would highly recommend that you create one for yourself. As soon as you kind of understand which features you use the most, right? Because you need to know what you need to have quick access to before you can kind of do this. But at a certain point, I would definitely recommend setting that up because you want to be efficient, right? I mean, being able to do good looking sculpts and stuff is great, but you also don't want things to take forever. You want to kind of streamline your process and not have to dig through a bunch of menus to use a feature that you use all the time. So the custom UI is something that I set up years ago, and I've made some pretty small additions to it over the years. But these are pretty much my go-to, my go-to actions that I use. So just use that in conjunction with hotkeys. Most of my most common brushes are bound to hotkeys. I usually go Shift A for the clay brush, for example, or Shift Q for move, or Shift W for standard. But you can do whatever you want. I know a lot of people who use the F keys or Control 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So just make sure that you're speeding up the process as much as possible. Because if you want to do this in a way that is sustainable, then you want to be able to set it up in a way that is convenient for you. So one more thing I want to talk about are some of my most commonly used materials. That's a question I get a lot. I kind of brought it up before. Skin shade being my main material for most of my characters most of the time, but I use a lot of other materials because, as I said, I kind of like to switch it up because it reveals a lot of areas that can be improved. So obviously skin shade is my most commonly used one. It's what I use, especially when I apply poly paint. I think it plays with that very well, but it's also a custom version, right? As I said, I kind of adjust some of the parameters in the material settings. And also I usually keep specularity pretty low, just because I like to kind of reduce the 3Dism, so to speak, as much as possible and kind of keep it flat shaded. Apart from that, I use flat color a lot when I'm inspecting the silhouette. Again, you need to look at things as a whole and not just kind of focusing on the micro details. So turning off colors and just applying a flat color material and kind of looking at the way the silhouette works from every angle is good practice. So I would definitely recommend that. And also, a lot of materials that I use frequently have to do with metals, right? So, for example, the little hairpin that she has, which is a super simple mesh, that's actually a separate material. It's one of the default materials in ZBrush. It's called MAH underscore shiny, and it's you can use a bunch of other materials. You have like chrome or droplet or reflect, but I kind of like to use that one because the effects are not too realistic, and I also always kind of reduce the opacity on that because again, I don't want it. I don't like it when things get too realistic. Aside from that, some of the materials that I use for the clay renders or basically the uncolored sculpted look, which as you notice I kind of switch between quite a lot, are some of the orb rock materials. You can find those on Google. You might recognize the orb name by the brushes. Those are also some of the most commonly used brushes. They are very, very good for sculpting rocks and walls and bricks and metals and all that good stuff. I really recommend using those brushes, and the materials play with that perfectly because it really allows you to look at the actual craftsmanship of the sculpt itself and not just kind of be distracted by the colors. So those are definitely some of my favorite materials to use. So yeah, just go to Google. You can put those in your Z startup folder in your Pixologic main ZBrush directory. That way they automatically load up when you load a ZBrush. I do that a lot for both materials as well as brushes. Yeah, you don't want to have to constantly load things up every time you open up ZBrush. So just make sure to spend the time to set things up in a way that makes things easier and faster for you. Because yeah, it can get a little bit, I guess, tedious, but ultimately it's worth it. So at this point, it feels like the hairstyle is slowly coming together. It's looking pretty good from one side, and there's still the big chunk in the back that needs to be addressed. But I have a pretty good sense of how the hair is kind of behaving and the directionality that I'm pretty happy with. It's just a matter of kind of repeating the same. And I know that at this point it can get just a little bit tiresome sometimes because it can feel a little bit tedious when you're doing the same action over and over again. But I think when you look at the final outcome, you don't really remember the, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 hours you spent constantly doing the same thing. You look at the final result, and once you're happy with it, then it'll all be worth it. So just don't be discouraged, keep at it, and eventually you reach a point where it's almost like muscle memory because you've done this so many times as I have that you it won't feel as tedious anymore, and you can kind of do things in the background while you're doing this. So that's kind of what I do a lot of the time. I'm kind of used to, you know, this whole technique and the workflow, and I've been doing it for years. That sometimes I tend to kind of do other things while I'm doing this. I don't know, watch a show in the background or talk to my family over the phone. And you know, it's I realize it's not for everyone because not everyone is that great at multitasking. I'm definitely not, but you know, at a certain point you don't really need to concentrate as much because you already have a pretty good sense of how you want the hair to look, and it's almost like autopilot. When you're done, you can make the finishing touches anyway. So yeah, just give it some time. Be patient and just play around with it. Just try to have fun with it. At a certain point, it'll just become second nature for you. So as you can see at this point, I'm kind of cleaning up some of the tips. I think using curves, the problem with the potential problem with that is that it can get messy very quickly. Just because you're creating so many meshes, so you know the more there is, the easier it is for it to get messy, right? So make sure that you're taking some of the tips and you're kind of merging them together almost. You don't have to physically merge the vertices, but all just kind of shifting the tips around to all be in the same space so you don't have a ton of super thin areas kind of all poking together like kind of like spikes or something. So that's something I always do. I kind of just sort of just nudge them a little bit to hide them in a way that makes sense, so it can feel like one whole shape as opposed to a bunch of different smaller ones. So that's just a polish thing that I definitely recommend doing. And there we have it, our second hairstyle is complete. Join me in the next chapter as we go over the most advanced and experimental of the three methods, Curve Alpha.